Let me introduce myself. My name is Thaddeus Monroe. I'm 34 years old and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm an ordinary person. I work in an accounting office and I lead a pretty normal life. Well, at least that was the case until the day I had an experience that completely changed the way I saw the world. Before I tell you what happened, I need to explain that I have had asthma since I was a child. It's not easy, you know. There are days when I wake up thinking it's going to be peaceful, others when I start to feel that tightness in my chest. Asthma has always been my unwanted companion. When I was a child, I missed a lot of my friends, birthday parties because I was having a meltdown, or because my parents, Anne and Richard, were afraid I would have one. I couldn't play in the park for long, run like other children. I always had to be careful. Sometimes they asked me why I didn't participate in physical education classes, and it was difficult to explain that it wasn't laziness or bad will. I grew up like this, learning to live with limitations, always with a pump in my pocket and having to explain to people that yes, asthma is something serious, but nothing prepared me for what happened that day. It was a Saturday morning. I remember it as if it were yesterday. I was at home, drinking my coffee in peace, leafing through the newspaper. It was a beautiful day. The sun was shining through the kitchen window, and I had plans to spend some time tidying up the garden later. Suddenly, I felt that familiar feeling of my chest tightening. At first, I thought it was just another common crisis, the kind that a firecracker solves, but within minutes, I realized it was different. The air just wouldn't come in, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if someone had put a wall inside my lungs. I used the pump once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. I started to panic, and the more panic I felt, the harder it became to breathe. My parents were home, thank God. When my mother saw me, her face changed completely. I think she realized right away that it was more serious than normal. My dad grabbed the car keys while she helped me up. The path to the hospital is a bit hazy in my memory. I remember hearing my mother praying quietly in the back seat while holding my hand, and my father running through some red lights. When we arrived at the emergency room, I could barely stand. The doctors took me straight to the emergency room, and the last thing I remember was seeing my mother's worried face as they put an oxygen mask on me. After that, everything went dark. It was there that my journey to a place I never imagined existed began, an experience that to this day I have difficulty putting into words. What happened next changed my life forever, and that's what I want to share with you. I'm not a writer or speaker or anything like that. I'm just someone who lived something extraordinary and feels like I need to tell this story. It was the strangest feeling I've ever felt in my life. One moment I was in the hospital emergency room, struggling to breathe, and the next, well, it's hard to explain exactly where I was. It's like trying to describe a dream, you know. You know what happened, but words never seem enough. The first thing I noticed was that I was no longer feeling desperate for air. In fact, I was no longer feeling anything physical. The weight of my body, the pain in my chest, the panic, it was all gone. It was as if I had left behind all the discomfort that asthma caused me. It was such a relief that, for a moment, I could only enjoy that feeling of lightness. Then I realized I was looking down at my own body on the hospital gurney. It sounds crazy, I know. If someone told me this before, I probably wouldn't believe it. But there I was, floating near the ceiling of the emergency room, watching all the movement around my body. I saw the doctors working, the nurses running from one place to another, the machines beeping. It was like watching a scene from a movie, except I was the protagonist. I could hear everything they said, every word, every command, pressure dropping. We need to stabilize him. Call the ICU. My parents were outside the room. I could see them through the glass door. My mother cried as my father hugged her, trying to appear strong, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I wanted so badly to tell them that I was okay, that I wasn't in any pain. The most impressive thing was how I could perceive everything with absurd clarity. Every detail of the environment, every expression on people's faces, even the number of fluorescent lights on the ceiling. There were 13, I remember to this day. The colors seemed more vivid, the sounds clearer, even though everything seemed to happen in a kind of slow motion. I tried to communicate with the people in the room, shout, wave, do anything to make them notice my presence, but it was as if I didn't exist in that dimension. My hands went through everything I tried to touch. That's when I started to understand that I was living something beyond our normal reality. He wasn't afraid, which is strange when you think about it. I was literally seeing my own unconscious body on a hospital gurney. But instead of panic, I felt an inexplicable peace. It was as if a part of me knew that this was natural, that I was safe, even without knowing what would come next. Gradually, the emergency room began to feel distant, as if I were being gently pulled somewhere else. The last thing I saw was the doctors injecting something into my body before everything started to go hazy around me. When the hospital room disappeared, I found myself transported to a familiar place, the kitchen of my home, but it wasn't exactly how I had left it that morning. The light was different, more golden, as if it were late afternoon, and there was a delicious smell in the air that took me back in time. Potato pancakes. My grandmother was there, just as I remembered her, preparing my favorite dish. I need to explain that my grandmother always made these pancakes when I was sad or sick. It was her way of showing love. Seeing her there, in our kitchen, stirring the pot with that wooden spoon that she never put down, wearing her flowery apron, it was as if time had come back. She hummed softly as she cooked, the way she always did. I was so moved that I tried to talk to her. "Grandma," I called, but no sound came out of my mouth. I tried again, harder this time, but it was like my voice was gone. I ran to her, wanting to touch her, hug her, smell that lavender perfume she always wore, but my hands passed through it as if I were made of air. The frustration I felt at that moment was indescribable. It was like those dreams where you try to scream and you can't. You know, she was there, so close, doing something so characteristic of her, and I couldn't interact in any way. I stood still, watching her every movement, the way she flipped the pancakes with precision, the way she arranged the plates on the table. The strangest thing was that I could feel her love filling that space. Even though she couldn't see or hear me, it was as if her presence emanated all the affection she always had for me. I watched as she placed an extra plate on the table, as she always did when she thought someone might stop by for a surprise visit. I tried to sit on one of the chairs, but of course I couldn't. I stood there, floating near the table, watching her prepare everything with such care. I wanted so much to be able to tell her how much a difference her pancakes made in my life, how special those moments in the kitchen with her were to me. Suddenly, the scene began to become blurry, as if fog was coming in through the kitchen window. The smell of pancakes became fainter, the image of my grandmother more distant. I tried to hold on to that moment. I didn't want it to end, but it was like trying to hold water with your hands, impossible to contain. When the kitchen and the image of my grandmother disappeared, I was swallowed by a darkness I never imagined could exist. It wasn't like that normal darkness when you turn off all the lights in the house, nor like being in a deep cave. It was different. It was as if the darkness itself was a living, pulsing entity. "Is anyone there?" I tried to scream, but my voice made no sound. It was frustrating. I could feel the strain on my vocal cords. Did I still have vocal cords? But nothing came out. The silence was deafening, if that makes sense. At first I tried to move, but it was impossible to know if I was actually going anywhere. There were no references, no support points. It was like floating in the middle of the ocean during a moonless night, only without being able to feel the water. I moved what I thought were my arms, trying to touch something, anything, but I only found more of that dense darkness. It was then that I began to realize that I was not alone. It was a strange feeling, like when you're in a dark room and you feel like there's someone else there. Little by little, I was able to distinguish other presences. They weren't exactly people, at least not as we know them. It was more like they were consciousnesses, floating lost like me. "Are you lost too?" I tried to ask a presence I felt close. Nothing. No sound, no response. But I could feel the confusion and fear emanating from her. It was as if we were all in the same situation, lost and scared, looking for a way out. Time was a strange concept there. I can't tell if I stayed in that darkness for minutes or hours. It could have been days or just seconds. At times, it seemed as if time had simply stopped existing. I started thinking about my family. Were they still in the hospital? How much time had passed in the real world? The feeling of disorientation became more and more intense. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, the kind where you try to run but can't move. I tried to calm down. I tried to think rationally. But how can you think rationally when you don't even know if you still have a body? "Please help me." I heard something like a distant whisper. It wasn't my voice, but that of another presence there. The sound, if I can call it that, was filled with anguish. I wanted to help. I wanted to find whoever had asked for help. But how could I find someone in absolute darkness? I began to feel a growing despair. Memories of my life began to flash through my mind. My last breakfast, the last conversation with my parents. The last time I complained about work, everything seemed so distant now, so insignificant. Had he died? Was this what happened after death, wandering forever in this darkness? It was in that moment of almost giving up that I noticed something different. At first it was so small that I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, a tiny point of light, infinitely far away, like a lonely star in a universe of darkness. I focused all my attention on that point. As I watched, I noticed that he was beginning to emit a different energy, something that attracted me. It was strange. I had no body, no physical form, but I could feel some kind of pull pulling me towards that light. It was as if something inside me, perhaps my soul, knew exactly what to do. I didn't need legs to walk or arms to swim. I just had to wish, and I moved towards that shining spot. The other presences also seemed to notice the light. I could feel some of them moving in the same direction, while others remained lost in the darkness. I wanted to call them, show them the way, but I still couldn't communicate. All I could do was move forward, toward that promise of light. I focused on that point of light with all my strength. It was as if something was pulling me towards it, like a magnet. As I got closer, the light got bigger, brighter, but it wasn't a glare that hurt the eyes. And that's a strange thing to say, because I don't even know if I still had eyes at that moment. It was a welcoming light, almost alive. When I finally reached the light, something happened that I still have difficulty explaining. It was like being enveloped in the warmest hug you can imagine, times 1,000. You know that good feeling when you were a kid, and your mom hugged you after a bad day at school, or when you meet an old love and realize that the feeling is still there. It was like that, only much more intense. The love I felt at that moment. Wow, how can I describe it? It was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my life. It wasn't a directed love, like what we feel for someone specific. It was a universal, unconditional love. It was as if, for the first time, I completely understood what it meant to be loved without judgment, without expectations, without conditions. In that instant, all the worries I carried simply disappeared. The fears about asthma, the everyday insecurities, the worries about work, money, relationships, it all seemed so small, so insignificant. It was like I finally understood that these things were just part of a much bigger picture. The feeling of peace was indescribable. You know when you're really, really tired and finally lie down in a comfortable bed, multiply that feeling by 1,000,000. I felt complete, as if I had found a place where I was always meant to be. There was no longer any separation between me and the light. It was as if we were the same thing. The most incredible thing is that, in that state, I could understand things that normally don't make sense to us. It was as if all the knowledge in the universe was there, available, and I could naturally understand things that previously seemed impossible mysteries. But it wasn't an intellectual understanding. It was more like a wisdom that came from the heart. I also noticed that time worked differently there. A moment could feel like an eternity, and an eternity could feel like a moment. It was as if past, present, and future all existed at the same time. It's difficult to explain this in words, because our language is made to describe things in sequence, one after the other. But there, everything happened simultaneously. What impressed me most was how connected I felt to everything. It wasn't just a feeling of unity with other people. It was a connection with all of existence, as if every atom in the universe was part of a great web, and I could feel every thread of that web vibrating in harmony. It was in this state of complete peace that I noticed a presence forming close to me. It was different from the presences he had felt in the darkness. This one had a more defined shape, more conscious, so to speak. Little by little, I was able to make out a female figure. I can't describe exactly what she looked like, because it wasn't like seeing a normal person. It was more like noticing an energy that chose to present itself in this way so that I could understand it better. She didn't need to introduce herself with words. Somehow, I just knew she was my spiritual mentor. It's funny because before this experience, I had never thought much about spiritual mentors or anything like that. But there, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. It was like meeting someone you've known for thousands of years, even though you've never met them before. Communication with her did not happen through words. It was more like a direct exchange of thoughts and feelings. She started showing me scenes from my life, but not as simple memories. It was like reliving every moment. Only now I could see the impact my actions had on other people. I saw a scene from high school when I helped a classmate who was being bullied. At the time, I didn't think I'd done much. I'd only spoken to him a few times and invited him to lunch with my group of friends, but now he could see how that simple gesture had completely changed the course of his life. It was like seeing waves spreading across a lake, affecting things I couldn't even imagine. The mentor showed me other moments like this, small acts of kindness that I had done without thinking too much. A smile for someone who was having a difficult day, a word of support for a discouraged friend, even the times I endured my asthma attacks with patience, serving as an example for other people with the same condition. But she also showed me times when I could have done things differently, times when I let fear or pride stop me from helping someone. There was no judgment in these revelations, only understanding and learning. It was as if she wanted to show me that every choice we make has a weight, even when we don't realize it. The most interesting thing is that she made me understand that there are no coincidences. Every meeting, every conversation, every difficult or happy moment is part of a bigger plan. Even my asthma, which I always saw as a limitation, had a purpose: to teach me patience, humility, and understanding the suffering of others. Through it, I began to understand that life is much more interconnected than we imagine. Every person we meet, every experience we have, is all part of a complex web of relationships and learning. During my conversation with the mentor, I noticed a new presence approaching. It was different from anything I had experienced so far, an even more intense, more loving light, if that is possible. When this presence manifested itself more clearly, I immediately recognized it. It was Jesus. Not the Jesus of the paintings in churches or the images we see around, but a presence so real and loving that it is difficult to put into words. I need to explain something. Before this experience, I was what you might call a casual Christian. He went to church on special occasions, believed in God in general, but had never been very observant. So, finding Jesus there was a huge surprise for me. And even more surprising was how different he was than I imagined. There was nothing intimidating or distant about him. On the contrary, it was like being in the presence of someone who knows you completely and loves you exactly the way you are. It didn't have that formality that we associate with religious figures. It was more like meeting a very dear friend, someone who understands all your struggles and weaknesses and yet accepts you completely. Communication with him was also different. They weren't exactly words, but I could understand everything he wanted to convey to me. One of the most important things I learned at this meeting was about the true nature of religion. He showed me that many of the rules and rituals we create are just human attempts to understand something much bigger and simpler: love. Jesus made me realize that the essence of everything is much simpler than we think. It's not the rules, rituals, or doctrines that matter, but how we treat each other. The love he demonstrated had nothing to do with judgment or condemnation. It was pure, unconditional, and universal. I remember feeling a kind of good shame for all the times I judged other people for their different beliefs. There, in his presence, it became clear that these divisions we create, Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, or any other religion, are our things, not his. What mattered was the love we showed for each other. I also saw how he suffered from the way his name and his teachings are sometimes used to hurt and divide people. It was as if he wanted to say, "This is not what I taught. It's not about separating, it's about uniting. It's not about judging, it's about loving." One of the most beautiful things I learned at this meeting was that true faith is much more about how we live and how we treat others than about following rules or going to specific places. It's about seeing the divine in every person we meet, regardless of their beliefs or way of life. After meeting Jesus, I found myself in an incredible garden. It was like no garden I had ever seen on earth. The flowers had colors that I don't even know how to describe, colors that don't exist in our world. Each flower seemed to emit its own light, and the most incredible thing was that I could feel life pulsing through each one of them. The air, if I can call it that, was pure and invigorating, as if each breath filled me with energy and well-being. It was in this garden that I had one of the most moving moments of my experience, meeting my grandfather. He was there, standing among the flowers, exactly as I remembered him before the illness that took him. He had that characteristic smile of his, wearing that old hat that he never let go of when he took care of the garden at home. The difference is that now he radiated a peace and wisdom that I had never noticed in him in life. When we hugged, and yes, this time I could really feel the hug, it was as if years of longing dissolved in an instant. The smell of earth and tobacco that I always associated with it was there, mixed with something else, something that only exists in that place. "Thad, my boy," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it. "You've grown so much." We talked as if time had not passed, as if he had never left. He told me about how he had followed my life all these years, how he had seen my struggles with asthma, my achievements, my sadness. "You know, son," he told me as we walked through the garden, "every flower here has its time to bloom, just like each person has their time on earth. It doesn't matter if the time is short or long. What matters is how you flourish, how you affect the lives of others around you." He showed me a particular flower, one that seemed stronger than the others. "See how she grew even with the strong wind, how she adapted and became even more beautiful because of the difficulties. That's how you have been with your asthma. Each difficulty has made you stronger, more understanding of the suffering of others." My grandfather always had this way of teaching through metaphors with the garden. In life, sometimes I thought he was a little silly, but there, in that place, his every word carried a deep meaning. He made me understand that our difficulties are not punishments, they are opportunities for growth. "Life is like this garden," he continued. "Each one has its role, its unique beauty. There is no flower more important than the other. They are all necessary to form this wonderful whole." As he spoke, he gently touched the flowers, and each one seemed to glow brighter under his touch. As I talked to my grandfather in the garden, I began to feel a kind of uneasiness. It was like something was calling me back. At first, I tried to ignore this feeling. After all, I was in a wonderful place, with people I loved, feeling a peace I had never experienced before. Why would I want to go back? It was then that my mentor appeared again. She didn't need to say anything. I simply understood that the time had come to make a decision. I could choose to stay there, in that place of infinite love and peace, or return to my earthly life. Seems like an obvious choice, doesn't it? Who wouldn't choose to stay in a place like this? But then I started thinking about my parents. I clearly saw my mother's face crying in the hospital, my father trying to be strong for her. I thought about what their lives would be like if I left now. Not that they wouldn't overcome. We always end up overcoming losses, right? But something inside me said it wasn't my time yet. "It's not an easy decision, is it?" my grandfather said, still at my side. "But you know in your heart what you need to do." And I really knew. As wonderful as that place was, as much as I wanted to stay there with him, with Jesus, with my mentor, there was something pulling me back. The mentor then showed me some images of what my future could be if I returned. They weren't clear images. They were more like possibilities, paths I could choose to follow. I saw that there was still a lot I could do, people I could help, experiences I needed to have. My grandfather gave me one last hug. "You will always find us in your heart," he said, "and when it's truly your time, we'll be here waiting." Jesus also approached, and that feeling of unconditional love enveloped me once again. No words were needed. I knew he would be with me, even if I couldn't see him anymore. The decision to return was not easy, but it was firm. It was as if my entire being knew that I still had a mission to accomplish. Not something grand like saving the world, but something equally important. Living fully the life I was given, with its joys and challenges. As I prepared to return, I felt immense gratitude for having had this experience. I knew I would come back different, not on the outside, Anant, but on the inside. The person who entered that emergency room would not be the same person who returned. It was as if I had received a precious gift, a new perspective on life. The process of coming back was very different from going there. It wasn't smooth or gradual. It was like being sucked back into the body, an intense and slightly frightening sensation. The first thing I felt was pain. My chest hurt. My throat was raw from the intubation. After being in that place of absolute peace, the physical sensations felt even more intense. I opened my eyes slowly. The hospital light seemed aggressive after the soft and welcoming light I had experienced. The first person I saw was my mother. She was holding my hand, and when she realized I had woken up, she started crying and calling the nurses. I wanted to tell her everything right then, tell her where I had been, who I had met, but I couldn't speak because of the tube in my throat. Doctors were surprised by my recovery. They said I had one of the worst asthma attacks they had ever seen, that my heart had stopped for a few minutes. For them, I was very lucky. Well, I knew it wasn't just luck, but at that moment, I couldn't explain it. I stayed in the hospital for a few more days. It was a difficult period, I'm not going to lie. My body was weak, and sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night afraid I wouldn't be able to breathe. But something had changed inside me. The fear of death, which had always accompanied me because of my asthma, had disappeared. In his place, there was a deep certainty that no matter what happened, I would be okay. When I finally returned home, everything seemed different. The colors seemed more vivid, the sounds clearer. The first time I walked into the kitchen and saw the place where I had seen my grandmother in that experience, I couldn't hold back the tears. My mother thought I was feeling sick again, but they were tears of gratitude. It took me a few weeks to start telling my family what had happened. I was afraid they would think I was crazy or that it was just a dream caused by the medicine, but when I finally told them, I realized they were more open to listening than I imagined. My mother even said that during the time I was unconscious, she felt an inexplicable peace, as if she knew I was being taken care of. Asthma is still part of my life, of course. I still have crises from time to time. I still need to use medication and take special care. But my relationship with her changed completely. I now understand that every breath is a gift. Every moment is an opportunity to learn and grow. I didn't write books about this experience. I don't give lectures, nor did I create any study groups. I continue to lead my normal life, working, spending time with family and friends. But I carry within me the certainty that there is something much bigger than we can see or understand, and that changed everything.